Hi everyone, I'm Lisa. I'm an alcoholic, and it's really nice to be here. I think I spoke at this meeting years ago when it was at the other location, but it really is nice for me to be here because I live in southern New Hampshire now. I've lived there for a year and a half. I moved there from the north suburban Boston area, but Worcester is actually where my life was saved because this is where I was introduced to the steps in the Big Book many years ago, and I have such a love and a fondness for this city. There's great recovery here, at least there was when I lived here. And I love this. It's fitting that this is the chapter because this is kind of where I was at when I was out here. I was the man with the carpet slippers and the bottle. I had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for a while, like seven years, and I got to the place where a lot of us get to before we find recovery in the steps, but I took it a step further and actually picked up. Doesn't matter the reasons, it's just, that's my solution. Until I can replace that solution of the alcohol or the other substances with a spiritual solution, I am going to revert to that when the pain gets bad enough. So I needed to be separated from alcohol. I needed to be hospitalized, and I came out to Worcester and lived in a halfway house here for months and months, and I stayed here for 2 years afterwards. I had an apartment on Vernon Hill, and just how much of a lie I was living, like even, so I'm just detoxed in a hospital, and I'm going into a halfway house, and the residents in the halfway house thought I was the new counselor that was coming in, because that's how I presented myself, like everything was a lie, and that's what this chapter is all about, the second half of step one. So it was, so I alternated between this, there was nothing in between, which is where reality is. The reality is in the in-between. I was either dressed to kill and looked very professional to match who I thought I was, or I don't know if this meeting is still there, but I went to a meeting on was it Friday or Saturday nights, but it was at Hope Ave, and it was a huge meeting. It had a reputation as being a pickup meeting, not pick up speakers, but pick up someone. and I had already, I was going through my second divorce, so I'm like, well, that's the solution, is I'm going to find husband number 3. So I would go to that meeting dressed, very slutty, and I'm looking for husband number 3. And I'm sitting in a seat, glued to my seat, because I'm so afraid to get up, because someone might look at me, because I'm so important, right? I'm filled up with fear, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what anything was. I couldn't identify an emotion. And needless to say, at this meeting, after meeting after meeting after meeting, I heard a woman speak in a way I'd never heard anyone speak before. And she was talking about things like trying to write a 4th step without having done a formal 3rd. And I was like, what is she talking about? I was intrigued. And something, which I know today was God, got me up out of my seat, and I approached her. It was the first time I'd ever gotten out of my seat and gone to talk to someone other than my very negative friends that I gossiped with, and I asked her if she would help me, and she said she only sponsored women through the steps as they're laid out in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and was I willing to go to any lengths? And I'm like, okay. I thought she was a weirdo, and there was a pocket of people that had moved out here from the Hyannis meeting, and they had started a really small meeting at Hahnemann Hospital, which later moved above the PIP shelter, which was mortifying to me. And that's the meeting that I found recovery and really got my life back. And I have no doubt that this is life or death. Since then, I have lost every single family member, except of course my own children, and to drugs or alcohol or the effects of alcohol, including my parents, all my siblings, save one who is now on a respirator and cognitively affected down in Florida. Like, that's it. I'm not supposed to be here. So I love what this city represents to me, because I'm here alive, and I moved back to the North suburban Boston area about 25 years ago, and since then I have been living by these principles and affected my family, my children, and hopefully others, and it's really nice to be back here. So I love the way that the book is laid out, like how it starts like we have a threefold illness, which is something that I used to hear at my first experience in AA, and I never knew what it meant, body, mind, spirit. And the book is laid out in the opposite order of what happens when I pick up a drink, because it starts with the doctor's opinion, right, which is about the body, and that's the last thing that happens, and if I'm not having alcohol in my body, then I'm not suffering from the physical effects of it, but I'm certainly dying, which I was, from the mental and the spiritual. I had no spiritual life, and this is the best illustration of what goes on in our minds that I've ever read, and I read a lot too. I've not as much as I used to with the self-help stuff. That was my osmosis pile under my bed. I was going to absorb this from, just these books laying there. It was this. So and then when I was out here, like that was the only meeting, this small meeting. There were 8 people that went to that meeting, and there was nothing else. There was only one woman there besides me. That was my sponsor. I had no choice, which there's a lot of choice that goes on today, a lot of switching sponsors, but she had the information I needed, and it was a love-hate relationship. But the part of me that wanted recovery more than I wanted to die, like, won. And every Thursday, they would pick me up and drive to Hyannis from here, and the men would go to the men's meeting, and my sponsor and I would go to the women's meeting in Hyannis. And just how I was back then, it's like 360 from how I am today. And this is me. Like, this chapter is me. And one of the exercises that I did, and sometimes I suggest to women I work with that aren't getting it, even in their writing, it's a great chapter to go back and circle all of the lies. Like, if you're struggling with the dishonesty, this chapter starts off with talking about the illusion, just all these other words for lies, trying to, all different methods of drinking, self-deception, okay, and the delusion that we are like others, all these like terms for lies. I hate using the book. I just like to go off my head, and this book has no notes in it, which is good. That was another thing that I've learned. Don't rely on what you've underlined before, because it makes it fresh and different things jump out to me every time. But it's pretty hopeless. Without a spiritual solution, even today, like, I'm dead. I'm not just, I'm my brother. I'm going to be the person that ends up, dead or on a respirator or suffering from some horrific effect of alcohol use, because that's where I'll go. I have evidence of that. And my current sponsor always says, I love this too, because she always says, every time I talk to her and I talk about something I've read in the newspaper, oh, guess what? And she always says the same thing. She's a scientist. Science may one day accomplish this, but it hasn't done so yet, making a normal drinker out of an alcoholic. And I just did all of the stuff that it talks about in here, except I think I probably never didn't take a trip, but everything else. The examples, and the other thing that my first sponsor, the woman that brought me through this work, did with me was she taught me how to turn statements into questions. And I do that when I read this to women that I work with, and there's no answer that's right or wrong, and you don't even have to answer it, because a lot of my answers were, yeah, no, I'm not interested in that. Are you interested in the medical estimate? No, I'm not really interested in that. That's okay. It's just the process of asking the question is actually a spiritual practice. And so when we went through this, there are 4 great examples in here of alcoholics and the mind, how the mind just sort of runs everything. It's not the alcohol. The alcohol was actually my solution. This is what's underneath it. It's how my mind works, and it can still go there at any given moment today, but thank God I have a solution today. So I really identified with this man of 30 because I had just recently relapsed and almost actually killed myself and 2 of my children. I mean, it was bad, and my relapse was only for a few months. I drove drunk. I had 2 kids in diapers that were not belted in, and it's a miraculous that they didn't survive. I have great compassion for, horrific stories that I hear, because I was this close to taking others out. Never mind me. It's the others that I worry about. So she asked me, I went through this whole story about this man that hadn't had a drink in a long time, and then he thought he was a victim of the delusion that after so many years he could take another drink. So he's obviously lying to himself, living, what looks like a good life. And then what happens to him, he doesn't just relapse and his life gets horrible. He dies, like he's dead. And she said to me, what do you think killed him? Was it the alcohol, or was it the thought that preceded that first drink? And that, oh, okay, yeah. It's an insane thought. It's a lie. It's a lie. And if you're in the writing process of this, there's lots and lots and lots of evidence of what we do as far as dishonesty in this particular chapter. So we have the man with the carpet slippers and the bottle, and then we have the jaywalker, which sounds crazy, but absolutely true. Like the jaywalker, he decides to stop jaywalking for good, okay? He shuts himself up in an asylum. It's crazy. It's the decisions that we make when we're not capable of making a decision. And all those things, those good slogans and sayings that I used to hear my first time are all in here, except I never had the background for them. I just heard them with no explanation. Jim, I do a retreat up in Maine with a friend of mine, and this is probably our favorite chapter to read out loud because I do I'm more the quiet one, and she's like very out there and funny, and so I start reading the Jim, and while I'm reading Jim, telling his story. You know, I had a few words with the boss, but nothing serious. And she'll go, lie. You know, everything, you know. I had no intention of drinking. Lie. I just thought I'd get a sandwich. Lie. I thought I'd find a customer for a car. Lie. Yeah, of course, because we all, you know, can do business in bars, right? Still no thought of drinking. You know, and on and on and on. And I mean, he had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he would take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. Our sound reasoning failed to hold us in check. And it didn't matter how highly educated I was or how much I thought I knew about alcoholism, which as it turned out was very little. It didn't help me. Even sober, even when I was out here in the early days before I met my sponsor, you know, I was not capable of doing much. I was barely able to take care of my children. I needed help. I was barely able to even hold a job. I was like overeducated, but I could not work in my field at all because I couldn't do anything that was mentally taxing. So for 2 years when I lived out here, I sold lottery tickets I don't think it's there anymore, but it was a place called the Newsroom that was right downtown by the bus station. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that was far below what I was capable of doing, and that's where I found myself, sober. You know, sobriety doesn't mean anything without recovery. I mean, I picked up a drink, and I remember too that I used to tell my sponsor, like I would alternate between wanting what she had and then sort of pushing her away and thinking, well, I was sober for longer than you are now, and she'd say, oh, yeah, but you're not. I'm sober longer than you now, aren't I? You know, just like crazy things like that. You know, I would just try to, when I started to think about things, which is always a bad idea, I would get myself in trouble. Like there were times where I wouldn't call her because I would think, well, she doesn't have the life experience that I had. She's never been, the other thing, she's never been married. She'd say, yeah, you're a great example of a successful marriage, right? Just everything, like all these things, whenever I would get into my head, I would get into so much trouble. And then we have the fourth example, which is actually my favorite. So there's lies, lies, lies throughout this chapter. And then we get to Fred. And I told her that I identified with everyone except Fred, you know, because he seemed too high functioning. And she started laughing and said, you are so Fred. I'm like, what? So she said, well, I'm going to read you this part again. So in the beginning, talking about Fred, it's, you know, you can see the lies. He went to the hospital to recover from the jitters. Yeah, okay. He told himself, that's always a lie. He told himself he came to the hospital to rest his nerves, okay? And then he made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. That's really gonna work. So even, and thinking about Fred, when he's telling these guys what happened to him, and he's in the hospital, pre-hospital, he had to have been a lot worse, but so even then, he's like, here he goes. And this is what my sponsor read to me and said was exactly like me. I was much impressed with what you fellows said about alcoholism, and I did not believe it would be possible for me to drink again. I appreciated your ideas, but I was confident it could not happen to me after what I had learned. I reasoned. I was not so far advanced. I had been successful. I would be therefore successful. I had every right. And I was like, she said, you are probably one of the most selfish people that I've ever met. But that's okay, because there you are. And I was just astonished that she would say such a thing to me. But later on, when I started my analysis and my writing, I saw that it was absolutely the truth. And I think it holds true for every one of us. If you're in this room, you're not here because you're a success. So this is all about the lie, the mind, where it takes us, and what's the solution. The solution is absolutely a spiritual solution, and the book details later exactly how to get that solution. And that was a promise that my sponsor made to me. She said that if you follow these directions, you will have a spiritual experience. Because I did not want to have what she had. I mean, I was like, I don't think I've come across anyone that was the way that I was with her. I mean, and I found out later, she moved, she became an attorney. She moved. I'm still in touch with her. Not a lot anymore, but we were more in touch for years, and we had fallen out of touch. And when the International Convention was out in Minneapolis, I got a letter and I got asked to speak at this meeting that was a huge meeting. And the topic was, gosh, what was it? I don't even remember. It was something about, it was about singleness of purpose. So I'm like terrified. I'm like so nervous because the meeting was in the same hall that Clancy had just spoken at. And I don't know if anyone's heard of him, but he draws a huge crowd, probably like, 1,000 people were in that room. And most of them stayed for the next meeting. And there were 3 speakers. And I look up, isn't one of them my sponsor, the woman that had taken me through. And she was the first to speak, and she got up and she started crying and saying that she had to get this out before she could talk about what she was going to talk about, and said that she was so grateful to see me because I was the first person that she had ever sponsored that hadn't died. And that just went right through me. And at the time, I was so in my head and so in self that I didn't even know any of that. And all those times that we were driving out to Hyannis, I just complained. I gossiped to all my friends that these people were all crazy. And I was so selfish, like I didn't know that she was going out there to meet with her sponsor because I didn't care. I was only concerned with myself. I never asked her any questions about herself. I mean, I was just probably the extreme example of how we can be, in our minds, which are selfish, dishonest, and self-seeking. Like, absolutely, like the max. So, I mean, that wasn't, and I was I was certainly well into practicing the principles that I had learned in this, and yet I was still at that place where it just like took me by surprise, and same as everything else, like the solution is a spiritual solution. And if you follow the directions that are laid out in this book, and the sponsors shouldn't matter, we all have the same information, even in the most extreme circumstances. I've known the other speaker that spoke at that Singleness of Purpose meeting has become a really good friend of mine. He's from India. He has done the steps out of the big book, but he did them himself. When he got sober in India, some friends of his tricked him into going to a meeting. He's at the same sobriety date as I have. And he went into the meeting. They had one of these books. They used to check the book out like it was a library, and they would hand copy chapters into lined paper notebooks. And he moved to the Middle East from India when he got up to the work, the fourth step, and he and a buddy of his just met, and they did exactly what it says to do. And that's what the book is designed for. It's designed so that anyone, anywhere, at any time, can pick it up and follow the directions. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, we live in New England where we've gotten pretty far away from the basic text, and that's why these types of meetings had to start up. And sometimes I think that we can get a little off track even in these meetings, but as long as if you ever have a question, and what I was told, because I only had one woman to check in with, and the guys, but I remember calling one of the guys in the meetings when I was in my writing, and I called him up, and I'm crying because I had just gotten into another relationship or whatever, and he says, pick up the goddamn pen and get back to your writing, and he hung up on me. And that's what I got. But despite that, and that's actually what I needed, if I ever had a question, ever had a problem, always, always, always refer back to the book. And if any kind of instructions that we give in here veer too far away from what it says to do in the book, then it might be a little questionable. I mean, there's a lot of room in here, but this is the way back to a life and having a life, and I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks.